Hello, my friends, and welcome back to this week's episode of Tuesday Tales of Terror. I am your host, Kali Mortwood, and I am happy to see you here. If this is your first episode, your first time here on my channel, what? How did you end up here? You need to catch up. We are on part 8 of The Man Who Was Poe. So if you would like to start from the beginning, I have the playlist listed in the caption below. And you can catch up and meet us here at chapter 14, which is titled Over the Edge. Now, if you'll recall, the last thing that we left off with was Mr. Dupin had just had a dinner party with Mrs. Whitman, who he is courting, and it was almost disastrous. He had a mild panic attack, I think. The poor thing saw demons and ghosts and believed that he was under attack. Now, to be fair, Mrs. Whitman did tell him everyone is an enemy here in the room, basically, before they walked in. So that just ended, and he's run off to go get his portrait taken for Mrs. Whitman to look at her leisure. We did also leave Edmund going to inspect the Lady Liberty, which is a boat that Mr. Fortnoy works on, or says that he works on. He's an elderly gentleman, and our detective, Mr. Dupin, believes that Mr. Fortnoy has something to do with murdering Edmund's aunt, as well as perhaps kidnapping his sister, Sis. That catches us up, and here we are. Let us begin. "It's Master Edmund!" Captain Elias cried when Edmund approached him on the quay. "You've been keeping yourself away. Did that sparkling sister of yours turn up right enough?" In the short while Edmund had been in Providence, he'd spent enough time at the docks, in the company of his sister, to have made friends with some of the regular workmen. In particular, he'd become close to a dockhand he knew as Captain Elias. The man had spent most of his life at sea. Now old, he'd been given a job of weighing out small cargoes on the wharves. Even Edmund suspected that the rank captain was one he'd given himself, but he seemed to know everything about the port of Providence. In exchange for their meager news, their dull days, his sister's complaints about Auntie Prue, to which the captain had listened with considerable sympathy, he had been more than willing to share his mind and experience. But as glad as Edmund was to see his friend, he had no heart to explain about his sister. It was information he wanted. "She's home," he said. "Well then," the captain returned, "it's not much good for anyone to be out today. And your proper auntie?" he inquired. "Home too," Edmund said, feeling obliged to spin out the lie. "Do you know," the captain said, dropping a wink even as he set a chest on his scales, "I thought I saw your auntie." "Did you?" Edmund cried. "When?" The captain grinned at the boy's reaction. "I said I only thought so, lad. Mind, you've never brought the lady round, so I've not had the pleasure of her acquaintance, have I?" Edmund shook his head. "But I'll tell you. This morning, early as can be, a lady rather like what you've described was wandering about. Half distracted she was, her clothing in terrible tatters." "It wasn't my aunt." "Oh, I realize that soon enough," agreed the captain. "But like I said, Master Edmund, this one's only reminded me of your description in a kind of interesting way. As for this unfortunate lady, she was asking about the dead woman." "The one found in the bay last night?" Oh my gosh, that was just last night? It seems like it's been days. So we just met Mr. Dupin. "It's all the talk here. A ghastly thing. There was to be an inquest today, which is what I told this lady. She was that interested. Distracted ones get drawn to such things, you see. Who was she? So I asked myself, Master Edmund, not that I have to start knowing. But I can see by your eyes you take such things to heart too. Well, you might. Every death is a mortal warning. Mind, I never saw the dead woman myself, though I had my part in it. What do you mean? See, it was Fortnoy who found her. Mr. Fortnoy? Edmund said, remembering what Mr. Dupin had said about the man. Himself? He's a good friend of mine. Edmund backed up a step. He is? To be sure, the captain returned. It was when Fortnoy was rowing back from his watch that he found her. That's where I came in. It was me who relieved Fortnoy so he could come ashore. Edmund's heart seemed to stand still. Do you know where he had been? Like I said, lad, on his ship. Oh, I don't understand. You see, his ship was the Lady Liberty, Edmund blurted out. Ah, you know her. She's an old ship, Nova Scotia brig out of Halifax. Captain Davis, her master, and a hard driver, that one. It was he who made Fortnoy stand watch 3 days running without a break. Elias shook his head. Can you imagine? Locked up, so to speak, for 3 days. 3 days? Said Edmund weakly. If that were true, perhaps Mr. Dupin was wrong about the man. 3 days, said Captain Elias emphatically. Not once was he left off till I went to relieve him. Captain Elias, are you very sure? I've not the slightest doubt. These things have a way of getting known. No one will stand watch on her now, not for love nor money. Is she in port? Sure she is. And this Davis has got to do the watch himself. Now, Master Edmund, have you time to hear a good yarn? I've got one for you. You see, the Lady Liberty had a sister ship, a Seahawk, her name was. Captain Elias, are you so very sure your friend was on the Lady Liberty for 3 days? Master Edmund, as I'm as sure as I'm sitting here talking to you. Did you want to hear that other yarn? I don't have time now. Right. I dare say your auntie will be after you. Well, you come back when you have an hour. And mind, next time, bring your sister. She'll like it particular. Edmund thanked him and went off, but the thought of waiting alone in his room was too depressing. Besides, all he could think of was that if Mr. Dupin was wrong about this Mr. Fortnoy, perhaps it meant he was wrong about all the other things of which he'd been so sure. Restless, Edmund began to wander aimlessly about the docks. There was enough to hold his interest. The on and off drizzle had brought a glossy, wet shine to every surface. Flares burned with smoky fumes. Goods, coils of rope, piles of spars were everywhere. Now and again he chatted with men he had previously befriended. All had a kindly word. Many asked about Sis. As he and Sis liked to do, Edmund began to search out interesting ship names. He found a fishing boat called Sea Swan, a coastal skiff named Ebony, and an old square-rigged merchant brig called General Jackson. Many a shared daydream had begun with such names. Seeing them now made Edmund sad. He turned away. With no fixed purpose in mind, Edmund made his way to the eastern end of the docks around Fox Point to the river wharfs where small fishing boats and ferries berthed. With weather so foul, work had ceased, and the longer Edmund wandered, the more desolate the scene became. It matched his mood. At last he turned mournfully for home, but as he did, he saw someone leap behind a stack of barrels. It was as if the person were trying to hide. Remember, he's been followed ever since he and Mr. Dupin parted. Edmund stood stock still, staring into the dark. Once again he recalled his notion that someone or something had followed him when he left his room the night before. And yes, wasn't it the same someone following Mr. Dupin as he went to Mrs. Whitman's just before? Now Edmund was not so ready to dismiss the idea. Seeing nothing, he shifted his eyes. He realized suddenly just how alone he was. His apprehension grew. Then he checked himself. What had Mr. Dupin taught him? Be certain. He must be sure he was being followed. Determined not to lose self-control, Edmund turned and continued along the deserted quay. To his left, across the river, city lights glowed. To the right rose College Hill, dark but for a few gas lamps. He saw no other person. For a few more moments he went on, then abruptly stopped and spun about. A figure scurried behind a box. Was it, he wondered, someone intent upon stealing him as his sister had been stolen? Perhaps he would be taken to where she was. But what if she, like his aunt, had been murdered? Trying to keep calm, Edmund spied a wharf which extended 50 or more yards into the river. It was, he saw, made of great crossed beams of wood arranged trestle fashion. 2 boats were tied to it, otherwise it appeared to be deserted. An idea came to him. If he went out to the end of the wharf, the person following him, thinking him trapped, might follow further. And if he, Edmund, reached the wharf's end first, he might also go under the wharf, scramble beneath it, then come up behind the person and see who it was. Okay, clever, clever. Moving slowly, as though he were not being pursued, Edmund stepped onto the wharf. At the halfway point, he halted and pretended to look at one of the 2 boats docked there. She was a small packet boat, a sloop which bore the name Sunrise. He stole a glance behind him. Through the murk, he could just make out that whoever the stranger was, he had followed him. 15 yards from the end, Edmund paused again. He took a deep breath. After reminding himself what he was going to do, he took another breath, then burst into a run. The moment he reached the wharf's end, he threw himself down, then swiveled so as to let his legs dangle over the edge, while his arms and hands, stretched to their limit, gripped the top surface planking. The wood was very splintery and cut his fingers painfully. Hand over hand, legs kicking madly, Edmund lowered himself into the inky blackness, each moment praying that his toes would find a crosspiece to settle on. His foot touched wood. Though he couldn't see the support, he had to trust it was wide enough, strong enough to hold him. He swung in his other foot. It too found a surface. Held. Now with both feet on the cross brace, he edged inward until he was standing firmly. The most difficult moment had come. Wanting to ease down on the piece where his feet were resting so as to get under the wharf deck, Edmund knew he had to shift his grip. He must release his hold on the top with one hand, then move that same hand down and grasp another support below. He made a tentative try, but he could not reach anything below the dock, while simultaneously holding on to the top. His arms were too short. It was then that he realized he was going to have to let go of the top completely and allow himself to fall. He'd have a chance, one chance only, to make a snatch at a grip underneath. If he missed, he would be in the freezing black waters below. His courage failed him. He could not do it. Frightened, he made an attempt to go back up, but he had gone too far. There was nothing to do but to continue. Swallowing hard, spreading his feet a little wider to gain more balance, heart racing madly, Edmund let go. In the instant of falling from the wharf end, he managed to shoot forward the hand already under the dock, swing down the other arm, then snatch at the wood with the tips of his fingers. The effort was just enough. Whew! He had grabbed hold of something, and he was quick enough to strengthen that small grip into a firmer hold. Though he had to gulp great draughts of air just to breathe, Edmund knew he was safe. Even so, there was no time to pause. It was impossible to know if the illusion he had meant to create, that of going off the wharf's end, had successfully fooled the person following him. Besides, even if he had succeeded, it meant only that the first part of his scheme had worked. Like a monkey in a cage, Edmund scrambled to beneath the dock. It was cold and slimy there. Masses of seaweed clung to the timbers around unexpected and painfully sharp clusters of barnacles. Still, he managed to move along the beams, over and under, until he was sure he was completely hidden. He paused, using his arms for balance. He was able to stand with some ease. As his breath returned to normal, he attempted to look about. It was too dark. Instead, he listened to the slap of water right below. The next moment, he heard steps on the wharf deck directly overhead. Crouching beneath the deck of the wharf, he listened as the footfalls passed and moved toward the end. There they stopped. Edmund held his breath. In moments, the steps returned. Again, they moved directly above him, then trailed back in the direction of the shore. Sighing with relief, Edmund put the last part of his plan into action. He began to follow along the beams, hoping to see whoever it was. He reached the shore end quickly. Once there, he groped about for some way to get back to the top of the wharf. He was in luck. Where the wharf met the quay, someone had built a crude ladder. He pulled himself up, poked his head out cautiously, and looked around. At first, it was too dark, too misty to see anything, and he heard not a sound. Then, gradually, some 20 feet away, he was able to make out what looked like the shadowy form of a man. But in the darkness, all that Edmund could be sure of was a glow, rather like a halo, of white hair. White hair. Was it, he wondered with new excitement, Mr. Fontenoy? Edmund searched for some way of getting closer, but before he could, the man began to move away until, to Edmund's dismay, he disappeared. All that was left of the sound of retreating footsteps. Edmund allowed himself to relax. Though disappointed to have learned so little, he felt real satisfaction, even a little pride. He had not the slightest doubt that the stranger had followed him in order to take him, as he had taken Sis. On his own, he had managed to avoid that. Suddenly eager to tell Mr. Dupin what had happened, that, slight as his evidence was, he had after all learned something of Mr. Fontenoy. Edmund set off toward Mrs. Whitman's house. Chapter 15. The Face on the Wall. Edmund stamped his feet, hoped it wouldn't rain again, and wondered what Mr. Dupin was doing inside Mrs. Whitman's house. Whatever it was, Edmund was sure the man was warmer than he was. Thinking he could knock on the back door and ask cook to allow him into the warm kitchen, Edmund started down the narrow side street. There he came upon the cemetery. It was the place, he remembered, where Mr. Dupin was to have met Mrs. Whitman. Though it was difficult to see, the only light came from candles in the windows of the house. Edmund stood, one hand on the gate, and peered into the graveyard. It didn't seem a suitable place for a meeting, but as he looked, he gradually became aware of some kind of shimmering whiteness among the tombstones and brambles. Puzzled, he finally realized it was a kneeling figure. For a moment, Edmund believed that the person was digging, as if to bury something. But he decided that was absurd. The person must be praying. Not wanting to intrude, Edmund backed away. As he did, the gate clinked. The noise caused the figure to jump up and stare in Edmund's direction. At first, the man, so blond that his hair seemed to be almost white, seemed startled to see Edmund. But the next moment, he offered a cheerful look and a ready smile. "Hello," he said. "I'm sorry to have bothered you," Edmund offered. "It doesn't matter," the man said, approaching the gate. "I was finished." "I'm just waiting for someone," Edmund explained. The man's smile vanished. "Someone here?" he asked. "In the house." The man glanced at the building. Even as he did, the rear door opened and a knife of light cut across the cemetery. "I must be going," the man said hastily. He pushed by Edmund and started up the hill, moving with such abruptness that a little book he'd been holding behind his back fell from his hand. Edmund hurried to pick it up. When he did, he saw that its cover was embossed with the words, "First Unitarian Church." "You dropped your prayer book," Edmund called. The man, however, continued to hurry away. Edmund was about to run after him when he looked toward Mrs. Whitman's house. Mr. Dupin had just emerged and was staring fixedly into the cemetery. For a while, Edmund watched the man closely, even followed his gaze. But when he saw nothing to warrant such rapt attention, he called, "Mr. Dupin?" Without replying or even acknowledging Edmund's presence, Dupin continued to stare. "Mr. Dupin," Edmund said, drawing closer, "when I was at the dock, Dupin cut him short. "Look over there," he said, pointing. Edmund looked. "What do you see?" Dupin demanded. "The mausoleum?" "Edmund," Dupin said after a moment, "I want you to go inside it." "Why?" "You must tell me what you see." What's there? Do as I say, Dupin cried. Suddenly anxious, Edmund stuffed the little prayer book into a pocket and made his way along the path to the mausoleum. At the steps, he stopped and looked back. Mr. Dupin, watching him intently, waved him on. Edmund went up the steps. Reaching the entrance, he halted and strained to see inside. The crypt was dank and dark and appeared to be empty. Relieved, Edmund called back, "There's nothing here." "Inside," Dupin insisted. Edmund, feeling increasingly frustrated, but wanting to placate Mr. Dupin so he could tell him about the wharf, took a step beyond the threshold. Still he saw nothing. He returned to the door. "Anything?" Dupin asked. Edmund shook his head. "There has to be something." "Mr. Dupin?" "On the floor," Dupin suggested. "A mattress?" "Nothing," Edmund assured him. Dupin, his face broken by shadows, continued to stare at the mausoleum. Edmund came back to him. The light from the house revealed how haggard Mr. Dupin had become. His mouth was drawn, his brow furrowed, his eyes bloodshot. "What is it?" Edmund asked. When Dupin spoke, he said, "I believe I've gone mad." "What?" Edmund said. "If it is madness to see ghosts, then I am mad." "What do you mean ghosts? Whose ghost?" Dupin looked at Edmund in such a way that the boy was seized with fright. "Is it my auntie's?" he asked in a hushed whisper. "My sis's?" "The story is over," Dupin announced. "Done." Then, as though coming back to life, he suddenly wheeled about, pushed past Edmund, and started down the hill. Edmund called out, "Where are you going?" "I must have a daguerreotype made," Dupin answered without pausing. "Mr. Dupin!" Dupin stopped and looked back. "My sister isn't dead," Edmund insisted. "She isn't." "You are perfectly free to believe what you want," Dupin replied, and once more turned down the hill. Edmund ran after him. Though he raged, shouted, even pulled at Dupin's coat to detain him from going, the man refused to stop. He continued to march on, saying not a word, as he reached the bottom of the hill, crossed the Providence River to the business section, and made his way up Way-Bosset Street. Half a dozen times during this rapid walk, Edmund came to a stop, determined to let Mr. Dupin go on. Each time, however, after watching Dupin disappear around a corner, he followed him again. It was as if, by losing sight of him, Edmund would in some fashion acknowledge the truth of what Dupin had implied about his sister. He could not do it. Dupin paused before the Providence Arcade. "I'm going in here," Dupin announced. Edmund gazed at the huge stone columns looming over his head. "What for?" he asked, close to exhaustion. "I'm in need of a portrait." After checking a registry in the arcade's central section, Dupin climbed 2 flights. Not understanding what the man was doing or why, but afraid that if he lost him it would be forever, Edmund kept a step behind. On the top level, Dupin went into a shop which bore the sign, Masonry and Hartshorn Studio, daguerreotypes. Inside, Edmund saw ferns, dark curtains, a large candelabra with none of its candles lit. Against one wall was a chair on a platform, and opposite, a big wooden box with a tube sticking out of it. The tube was pointed at the chair. Behind this machine was a wall covered with small portraits. As soon as they entered the studio, a formally dressed man, red-faced and with a large mustache, scurried out from a back room. "How do you do, sir?" he said with a stiff bow. "I'm Mr. Massery." "I should like a portrait made," Dupin said. "At your pleasure," Massery returned. "It will cost $1. Dupin paid, and after handing Edmund his great coat, allowed himself to be directed by Mr. Massery to the chair on the platform. There he took a seat and adjusted his cravat, making sure the top button of his jacket was open, while he buttoned the second. "Very good," Massery said. "If you're thoroughly composed, I shall make sure the plate is ready." He ducked behind the curtains. Edmund took a seat off to the side, glad for the rest. Masonry returned, placed what looked like a thin box into the rear of the wooden machine. That done, he hastened to light all the candles. They made the room as bright as day. "Now, sir," he said to Dupin. By this time he was standing at the side of the box. "Look this way. It will be necessary to hold still for an entire minute. If I may suggest, set your gaze right over my shoulder. These portraits, if you will. Are you ready, sir?" "I am," Dupin replied, taking a breath. "Eyes forward, then," Maestri called. "Ready? Start!" Dupin froze. He was, as Maestri had told him to do, staring right at the portraits on the opposite wall. As the count of seconds progressed, Edmund saw Mr. Dupin grow pale. The man's hands clutched with tension. Beads of sweat gathered on his forehead. A look of undisguised horror came into his eyes. Maestri, unperturbed, monotonously continued counting 51, 52, 53. "Done!" he cried. At the word, Dupin leaped from the chair, took 3 steps across the floor, and pointed to one of the portraits on the wall. "When was this made?" he cried. Maestri was so startled by the force of the question that he almost dropped the box he had removed from the machine. "Oh, I must put this in the mercurializer," he explained, "or the image will be lost." Dupin reached out, grabbed the man's shoulder, and forced him to look. "When was this made?" he demanded a second time, jabbing a finger at a small portrait on the wall. Thoroughly frightened, the man peered at the picture. "Why, months ago," he sputtered, then broke free of Dupin's grip and hurried behind the curtain as if his life depended on it. Dupin now turned on Edmund. "When did you come to Providence with your aunt?" he cried. Edmund was too terrified to reply. "Oh, answer me!" Dupin shouted. "A month ago," Edmund got out, shrinking back. "Then who is this?" Dupin insisted, snatching at the boy with one hand, pointing toward the portrait with the other. "Who is it?" Ready to bolt if Dupin became more violent, Edmund crept a step closer. "Tell me!" Dupin shouted in a rage of impatience. Edmund, trying to understand what Mr. Dupin was getting at, squinted at the picture. Suddenly he felt faint. "Why," he stammered, "it's my mother." Dupin dropped his arm. "Your mother?" he cried. "I thought it was your aunt." Edmund kept staring at the portrait. "It's my mother," he said, finding it difficult to speak. "I know it is." "But she looks exactly like your aunt," Dupin protested. Edmund couldn't take his eyes from the image. "Not exactly, but they are twins." "Twins?" Dupin gasped in a shocked whisper. "Like Sis and me. I told you we were." The whiteness of Dupin's face gave way to redness. "My God!" he cried. "Twins!" "What's the matter with that?" Edmund demanded indignantly, unable to cope with yet another shift in the man. At that moment, Maestri came out of the back room. "A few more minutes and it will be ready," he announced cheerfully. "I can't wait," Dupin shouted. "I'll be back." Grabbing Edmund's hand, he rushed out the door. "Your name, sir!" called Maestri, following. "Your name!" Dupin paused only long enough to call, "Poe! Mr. Edgar Allan Poe!" And down the steps he fled. No matter how Edmund tried to make Dupin explain what he was doing, even what he meant by giving a different name, Dupin would not listen. Instead, he rushed back to the cemetery behind Mrs. Whitman's house. There, before the gate, he stopped. "Now, Edmund," he announced, struggling for breath, "we must look everywhere." "What for?" "I don't know," Dupin returned. "Something. Anything. It will be her. It must be. It has to be." Edmund gazed at him, baffled. Not that Dupin waited. He pushed through the gate and began to search wildly about the grounds. After a moment, he looked back at Edmund. "Are you going to help or not?" Though he had no idea what it was he was supposed to find, Edmund started to search too. Suddenly Dupin bent over. "Straw!" he cried out. "Straw from the mattress! Someone has removed and scattered it. Immediately he turned to the mausoleum, went up the steps, pulled open the door, and looked in. Gingerly, Edmund followed. "On your knees," Dupin commanded. "Feel around." Again Edmund held back. "Do it!" Dupin shouted at him, as he himself crouched down on his hands and knees. "Every inch." In moments, Dupin gave a triumphant cry. "Ah, there!" he shouted, picking up something and hurrying back to the doorway. "What is it?" Edmund said behind him. "Look," Dupin said, and thrust out his hand. In his palm lay a white button. Another white button. Someone is leaving clues. Well, my friends, that concludes our reading for this evening. Once again, thank you for being here, and I truly hope that something magical happens to you this week. Peace, love. Mwah. The power is yours. Ciao for now.